We had 18 months to develop our
Hello everyone, welcome to my platform. Glad you are here. I am honored this week to be welcoming Mr. Joe Rothenberg. Mr. Rothenberg was a guiding force behind the first in-space servicing mission of the Hubble Space Telescope for NASA, and which in itself is a massive accomplishment. Mr. Rothenberg has an incredible career spanning over 6 decades and has served in almost every single technical and leadership role within NASA. He started his career in 1964, and 19 years later, in 1983, he entered Goddard as an operations manager for the Hubble Space Telescope. In 1987, he was appointed as chief of Goddard's Mission Operations Division, and in 1989, 2 years later after that, he was appointed as Deputy Director of Mission Operations and Data Systems. In 1990, he was appointed as the Associate Director for Flight Projects for Hubble. In 1995, he was appointed as Goddard's overall director, and 3 years later, he was appointed by NASA as the Associate Administrator for Spaceflight. For almost a decade, from 2003 until 2011, Mr. Rothenberg represented the Swedish Space Corporation as a president and senior vice president of international development. He was Google's engineering director for Terra Bella, which was formerly known as Skybox and was acquired by Google for $500 million in 2014. Mr. Rothenberg was also the chairman of the technical advisory board governing Skybox images. Since 2016, he has chaired and taken part in multiple technical and executive advisory boards, including Conrad Foundation and 7Benefit Limited. Currently, Mr. Rothenberg is member of the board of directors at Conrad Space Development Corporation. Now, this interview is not short by any means. It is 5 hours long. I was extremely eager to understand every single detail of the career path of Mr. Rothenberg, every single challenge encountered, every single obstacle that had to be overcome. He was extremely humble and kind to be able to allocate 3 different recording sessions to my initiative, and I want to thank him for that. To make this easier for you to digest and for me to produce and edit, I will produce this as 3 different chapters, i.e. 3 different videos, each one covering a specific aspect of Mr. Rothenberg's life. Usually, at least I believe so, I try to withhold my enthusiasm for those interviews and make them look extremely professional. That is the premise of my channel. This is what I do. I couldn't help but smile throughout the entire process in the face of the sheer amount of knowledge I gained from my discussion with Mr. Rothenberg. You have to also understand that the totality basically of my guests, they are volunteers. They volunteer their valuable time to enlighten me and you guys without necessarily getting something back. These are good-hearted, first of all, but accomplished professionals and leaders who freely allocate their time to educate the young generation. I want to thank all of them for that. Now, it is a very rare occasion that I can completely unfold my thought process and ask every single question I want to ask to every individual. Usually I have about 30 to 40 minutes. It is very difficult to compress somebody's career in 30 to 40 minutes and extract lessons from it. It can be enough, but it is not always enough. This interview with Mr. Rothenberg stands as one of those rare occasions. Together with us, you will understand every single decision an awarded top leader at NASA made throughout his career. You will be immersed into the world of difficult decisions, losses, major project breakthroughs, people management skills, what went right, what went wrong, what would he do differently if he was to go back and do it all over again. This interview, in my opinion, can be considered a fairly complete roadmap, a point of reference if you want, without exaggerating, for every single individual who wants to become a leader. You don't necessarily have to belong or aspiring to enter the aerospace industry. Doesn't matter which industry you want to go. I don't believe this interview should be viewed only once. I believe you should be revisiting this interview, watching it again and again and again, At least when I was editing it, every single time I was viewing it with a different point of view, extracting a different lesson each time. I don't want to drag this any longer. I want to let Mr. Rothenberg speak his truth, and you can make a decision as far as the value of the interview. But I hope you find it in the same way I did. How is the decision going to be made for a program when it goes against the political line that the government has drawn in NASA? Have you ever encountered a program like this?
If the congressional language said they must buy a launch vehicle from SpaceX, it wouldn't be that prescriptive, but it will be prescriptive. It could be, okay, for a certain kind of mission where if you don't buy it from SpaceX or somebody else who has it one commercially, you're going to have to develop it, and they don't want, that obviously becomes prohibitive. How was the culture after 1986? So in the late 80s, after the accident happened with the Challenger in NASA?
Obviously, there was more formality to the decision process and more rules in place after the Challenger. For example, the fact that management overruled an engineer, that was the principal. That's what caused the problem. But the problem, I mean, was the design. But nevertheless, if they lived by the temperatures you pointed out, good chance they wouldn't have had that problem. But when I was asked to take over lead the repair mission, was in the end of July of 1990. At that point, it was a national disgrace, a national joke. The comedians, everybody. So that had a rippling effect. Okay, Congress, of course, wasn't going to stand up and support something that was an embarrassment to the government. And
in spades will be remembered as stepping up to the challenge and knocking it down and turning it around into a victory.
There were two main topics that I think we didn't cover enough in the previous sessions we had, mainly around ethics in the industry, which is, I think it deserves an interview in itself. And then another one which deserves an interview in itself, which is politics, basically. So I want to understand how those two together, so politics and ethics in corporations, especially in a corporation like NASA, which you've had a lot of experience in, interfere with making decisions. So, for instance, I know that NASA, if we go back when it was introduced in 1958, there was a massive race to go to the moon with the Soviets during the Cold War. It was a matter of national pride as well.
mm-hmm.
What about the ethical part when you involve people's lives? We know that there have been some safety issues we discussed about the Challenger and Discovery last time. Were you ever placed in a position where you had to make a decision, but something in you told you, well, I'm trying to do this, but there might be an ethical dilemma here?
I have never trying to think. I can honestly say if it ever, it was a one time, but I do not remember ethics and moral judgment ever been in conflict with what I had to do. Where I felt I did something for reasons that were against my better judgment or what I felt was morally incorrect. I don't. I mean, even in dealing with the political side of things, where we made some program decisions to ensure that we kept the people happy in a particular state because we wanted the vote from a particular senator or congressman. In fact, I could argue just the opposite. I made some decisions where were in conflict what the state wanted, what the state senate the delegation would have liked, and the only ethical question was they asked me to put it off and not announce it the day before the election. Put it off a day. And that's perfectly reasonable, even though in this particular case, it wouldn't have affected the election at all. Nobody would have known about it, but they didn't want to make it look like it was a political announcement to support anyone or not support anyone. And it wasn't. It was purely a program win, not a win, but a award, a proposal award. Evaluation team had done all their work, and they came up with an answer. In fact, that answer was in conflict with what that particular senator felt was the best thing for her state. On the other hand, all she asked me to do is don't announce it the day before our election, and that was when we were. That was it. We always informed Congress before we made an announcement of any magnitude. So they didn't get caught blindsided when their contractors came to them and said, I don't agree with that, or I do agree with that. They were at least aware of it, and they might have said something, we'll look into it, we'll ask questions or file an appeal if you believe it was appropriate. But so I guess to answer your question, I'm searching for something other than that, which is marginal, that might have been considered where I was doing something purely for political reasons and not for, and there was no, and I was compromising what I believe was right. And I don't, nothing jumps out at me, but if you've got some specifics or, thoughts that might evoke something, I'd be welcome to entertain them.
What I was thinking is the information data flow within the company from your position downstream and upstream. Basically, what I mean is, did you ever identify a point in the company that lacks in development because of the company structure? Do you believe the company maybe
Yes, absolutely. I'll take, not of your company, I'll take NASA Goddard. When I took over as Senate Director, I believe, based on my experience and my recent Indy experience, that they were still in the 1980s, where their thinking needed to be forward. And we went through a 3-year restructure program at NASA Goddard, and it took me 9 months to get my direct reports, who are all excellent people. I am not going to come in there and fire them. To get people in there who think like me. I believe they were the right people to lead it. So my job was to convince them that we needed to make a change. We needed to do something different. And we ended up coming up with a new vision for the Senate, making sure that all employees were aware of it. And we reorganized the center and moved 1,800 out of 3,200 people into new jobs. We had 80 branch heads. We removed them all. We told them in the new structure, they may or may not get the job again, because the 80s were much more focused on technical excellence internally, and the 90s and beyond were much more focused on being technically smart, but also people oriented, much more family oriented, and consideration of the. We went from an era of a lot of single parent, you know, parents where one parent worked and the other watched the home, and we, in the 80s and 90s we shifted to one where there were two parent working, and so some of the practices we had were not friendly to that. As one example, I mean, the travel. People jumped on an airplane, and when it was a problem, and that's the first thing they did is jumped on an airplane, and then found out if they could solve the problem when they got there, versus sitting back and saying, "What are my tools?" And so we put in just simple change. We put in point to point with all our major contractors, video conferencing, and a lot of employees could deal with problems face to face or sit through meetings while being in Greenbelt versus having to sit in Colorado where there was 1 hour out of 2 days of was really primary interest of them. And so we restructured, reorganized. The second thing is we were organized in such a way that were flight systems and ground systems. And again, the technology changed, and it was no longer like that. It was thought of as a system, and you allocated functions back and forth far differently than you did 20 to 30 years ago. The compute power you could put on board and all sorts of things changed the way we did business. So we restructured the center around a vision of how we wanted to be forward. I don't know what I mentioned it in my prior talk, but most of the space systems in the 1960s, 70s, and 80s evolved out of the 1940s and 50s aircraft industry. Power, thermal, the subsystem was divided, and the organization. I worked at Grumman, it was organized that way. Goddard was organized that way. They were organized around the architecture of the systems in the past. And one of the things, I'm a burn the boat guy. If you want to change the way you do business, you got to look at what you're doing in the past. And if you figure you can't bring those people forward, you got to burn the boat, so to speak, and start all over. And so that's kind of what we did, but I did it in a consensus way. I spent the 9 months, many offsites, brought in outside facilitators to bring my management team, recognizing that we were no longer entitled. The Cold War was over. We needed to earn our place, and we needed to make a contribution versus an entitlement. And we needed to make partnerships with academia and companies who had equally as competent technologists and scientists as we did, and let the best solution or the best scientists lead the team. And so we formed the Joint Centers of Excellence. Wasn't my idea. My team came up with it I kept telling them, here's what my vision of the future, and I gave them 7 things that I felt were scars that we needed to fix from the past, and worked on them for 9 months. They finally agreed, and then turned over to them the process of making and leading the change, and they did. And I motivated them. I changed the big thing you learn in running any organization is the value system needs to match the goals of the organization. For example, we wanted to facilitate more team across organizational structure teams to accomplish things versus stovepipes where if they didn't have the capability, they went and bought it, hired a contractor or hired people versus looking to the guy in the next office who may have everything they need, and so we facilitated that by eliminating or reducing the number of individual awards and checks that went with them at the end of the annual awards thing to team awards. The teams and will recognize the higher priority awards were gone to team efforts and building teams and leading teams and team accomplishments. And we make sure so you change the value system. The scientists, believe it or not, their value is travel money. That was their scarcest resource. Promotions are always about travel money. So what I did is and to encourage the forming of joint centers of excellence with universities, I gave the ones who came in with the proposals of the joint center of excellence extra travel money, and it's only one pot, so we know where it came from. The science groups that didn't, the teams that didn't. So you change the value, and it's important if you want to change the culture, you want to change how people behave, you need to change the reward and value system. And also, you can't do it arbitrarily. You have to convince them there's a need to change, and the value system is what keeps them in focus on the change versus going back to their old ways. So
I think you're bringing up two very important points here. The one that jumps in mind immediately is how possible is to diversify a portfolio of an aerospace conglomerate like NASA. I know 500,000 people contributed to the creation of the space shuttle. So there were partners naturally. But how possible is to diversify the portfolio of NASA, for instance, per se?
By portfolio, are you talking about the work content, the programs they're working on?
Exactly, the programs they're working on.
That's really simple. It really is, but that's simply totally driven by the congressional budget allocated to NASA and the priorities they set. I mean, no bucks, no Buck Rogers, no money. You chase, you presume for first that Congress is lining up and funding programs that they believe are in the broader national interest versus just NASA. Okay, you have to, that isn't always true. Some of it, of course, is politics, where it's some particular state senator is in a very powerful position, and he proposes a program that, it probably ought to be done, but is it the highest priority? He makes it the highest priority because he says that's where I'm going to focus the funding on, but it may not be in the highest priority what NASA would like to do, but that's how you change the portfolio. Is the congressional budgets come down, you believe they reflect the national priorities, and not all, and many of them are argued out at the congressional level. They call hearings, they invite NASA to describe what the implications of various budget decisions and program starts are, and NASA, of course, is there with their priorities, saying we would like these funded. Congressional wrestles that to the ground between the White House and Congress. They wrestle it, approve a budget, and that sets the portfolio. And as an example, they just shut down a major satellite servicing, refueling demonstration that a couple of $1 billion was spent on or over the years, and they shut it down because industry has stepped up to be able to provide that service. So it's not in the best use of taxpayers' money to have the government provide it. When the government can buy that service, they don't have to develop the capability. That service, the important thing in any service like that is that NASA or the government is not the only buyer, only customer. A commercial service, by definition, needs to have multiple customers, and you buy and you pay for what you use, and therefore the infrastructure to provide the service or to develop it or to manufacture a product is shared. The cost of an infrastructure is shared amongst many customers. Where historically, back in the Apollo days, if NASA wanted something, in many cases, a company formed a division that totally supported NASA, and they paid the entire infrastructure cost for it. There were no other customers for the product. The culture has changed where NASA's buying products that there are other customers for. The launch services is a perfect example. Over time, that transition from a totally government-driven and process to a private service providers, as well as many customers using it. Where in the very early days, it was principally a government, between NASA and DoD, a government-used resource. Once we started getting into commercial communication satellites, for a while they were launching on government-provided services, and that changed when they turned over those services in the 1980s. The launch services to private industry, and so things can change, and it generally change by budget. An easy way to get NASA to go to buy things external versus develop it on their own there's been a policy in place since the 90s that I know, maybe been earlier, that says when a new program started, government should look to industry to see if that's available, that service or some components of available. That's the policy. The practice was Well, let me figure out for sure how I can prove that service doesn't exist. Oh, it's got to be painted orange and green. That's how I'm going to assure that. There were subtleties put in there because people wanted to develop something instead of buy it and put it together, right? They wanted to be creative. So people found many ways to circumvent the plan. There's a NASA National Academy report out that I was a participant in, and in there I put several chapters in on programs where the Air Force said we're going to buy commercial services. They put the money in place, and we found out that every other government agency but the Air Force used that service because the general who legislated that moved on, and the people under him immediately went back to their old ways, and they never used the contract. But on the other hand, 2 or 3 other government agencies used it and saved, like, out of $1 billion, saved somewhere around $500 million in just a couple of years. So it clearly was a valuable thing. It was just a certain culture felt that they needed to own it. But you start squeezing their budget and find out they really don't have the money to develop it. All of a sudden, they then do start to look for what can I buy commercially to offload it. Congress, of course, looks for that too because they'd like to minimize the amount of funding for a program. If they see a commercial service out there, they will point to that service and say, you guys are going to use that as part of your program, and I'm going to cut your budget by the amount you would have spent internally for that. So there's ways to change. All I'm saying is that it's usually budget is the way to drive a change, at least in the government structure.
It begs the question of where are the limits or the cliff, I'd say, when you have the federal government acting as your main customer or dominant shareholder in an organization. So how is the decision going to be made for a program when it goes against the political line that the government has drawn in NASA? Have you ever encountered a program like this?
How is the decision going to be made? For example, the government, the Congress allots a million, 100, it doesn't matter, but lots of budget for a program. There's a process in NASA that the program goes through. The first part is kind of a concept, which talks about I'm going to buy this commercially, or I'm going to. So they go through that process and it's reviewed. Number one, the budget was set. If they can demonstrate at that point that it's in the best interest of the government or the risk to the government to buy commercially is viable, that's when that's looked at. If the congressional language said they must buy a launch vehicle from SpaceX, it wouldn't be that prescriptive, but it will be prescriptive and say it could be, okay? For a certain kind of mission where if you don't buy it from SpaceX or somebody else who has it one commercially, you're going to have to develop it, and they don't want, that obviously becomes prohibitive and schedule-wise and time-wise. So the review also looks at it against the congressional authorization language. And at the end of that, they approve the implementation of the program, or they send them back to the drawing board. So that's the first checkpoint, and that's probably the one that sets the course of the ship, so to speak. After that, it becomes more difficult to turn, okay? JWST is a good example. When it was first put in place, they set a set of rules on foreign participation. European Space Agency participation, etc. And they put in place an European Space Agency agreed to participate only if they could supply some of the instruments. And when the review team looked at it, at the conceptual review, they said that would be the most complicated arrangement. How about providing an Ariane for the launch? Well, of course, the Europeans don't want to provide an Ariane. If I'm using European Space Agency money, I'd like it to go into developing new technology in Europe as the first priority, not buying a commercial boat, even though it comes from Europe, right? It's not, the agency is not about commerce. It's about developing capabilities, develop national pride as part of it. Um, they can trade NASA for 2 seats on the space shuttle or 2 seats on the space station. They do that all the time. That's you see all these foreign astronauts. Most of the reason is national pride. They want to have somebody they recognize in space. That gets their taxpayers to support their country's space budget, and it helps ESA as well as the country. I mean, that's the name of the game, right? It's something that you can use to make sure your taxpayers continue to support what you want to do, and whether it be space or air or anything, and getting an astronauts on board, identifying with your country is a national pride thing. So anyway, back to your question, it's that review process that makes sure that it fits within the guidelines. Beyond that, it's the head of the review committee and the team that looks at it and pokes and say, there's a company down the road that does the exact thing. Why are you not buying it? That's the review team's process. And having been on both ends of that, more, since I retired, more review teams than not. In fact, not as an aside, I'm the one who pushed to switch and go with the area as the European contribution. And I pushed hard enough. It made sense to NASA because it reduced the overall program risk. And that's what they did. It took them a couple of years to get ESA to come around. And I think they gave them both the ability to provide some instruments plus, in fact, they did. But anyway, so the point is that that's the process.
Mm-hmm.
And those review committees, at least the ones I've been on probably a dozen of them, and I've been on National Academy committees, do not, they recognize political desires, okay, that are purely political, have nothing to do with it, but they really don't factor, they really make, they make sure that that's not the forcing reason for the decision, because they're pretty well insulated from the Congress. They're independent. And they usually have enough people on the committee of national stature that a congressman can't just roll over it and say they're wrong and ignore it. He's going to have other constituents, other colleagues pushing back on him, and that generally crosses party lines. It really isn't along party lines. A lot of things are played where NASA's a punching bag for for the parties. They pick on NASA, but they're really trying to pick on the administration. But at hearings and stuff. But when it comes to something tangible, implementing a program, generally that crosses political lines. I've been in meetings with 2 senators, each of opposing parties. Both of them totally agree on what we need to do. Both of them know that the committee is going to toast me and the Congress, and they're telling me, that program as it's going is the right thing to do, and we both support it. When it comes to a vote, we'll support it. Then I go into the hearing, and they beat me up, and I say yes, get on my way.
I think it brings. Yeah, go on, please. If you want to
Say it again. No.
Go on if you want to add something. Yes.
No.
So, what I'm thinking about is the element of also political, I would say, responsibility, because you were inherently all your life into industries that bear significant risk. We talked about what happened with the Hubbard and the servicing mission, which was extremely risky. With the JWST, it was permanently destroyed by asteroids. So I think NASA has a track record of understanding that there is great risks out there. What do you think is
I'm sorry, you just said JWST was destroyed by asteroids?
It was permanently damaged by asteroid attacks, wasn't it? Or am I wrong?
No, it had some what's called micrometeorites, fragments.
Yeah.
Hit the mirror, but you can't put something up that big in space. Our solar arrays on Hubble got hit by it all the time. But in fact, when the asteroid storms go, we turn it around, so the back end, not the mirrors. But that's a problem in space. Space station gets hit by it, pings on the glass and on the observation tower. What happened on JWST is they got a few asteroid pings on the mirror, but when you design it for the area of light collection, you make an assumption on a statistical assumption on how many asteroid hits you're going to get per year. And you look at that and make sure that the mirror is over-designed such that the light collecting capability of the mirror is not degraded beyond where it's doing the primary science it was designed for. So the damage, yes, the mirror got nicked, but that in no way degraded the science capability. In fact, the couple of hits I got were so small that they're negligible. But that in no way is that degrade the science capability that it can't perform the mission it was intended. I mean, that was expected in the design, and it was oversized, or rather than oversized is probably the wrong word, but when they analyzed what they expected the photon efficiency of the mirror would be, collection efficiency, they made the assumption that it'd be, 5% per year degradation or 2%. I don't know the number.
Yeah,
could be 0.5%. But per year, the degradation in the mirror over time, and at the end of its 5-year design mission, the primary mission life, that it would still be able to meet what we call level 1 requirements for light collection, optical throughput, and so as far as I know, anything close to being at risk.
Also, I think it is very important to tap into the risk strategy and how it developed throughout the years in the corporation. What kind of development did you introduce yourself on that strategy, the risk strategy for the projects you were occupied with? And also on the secondary strand, what kind of development did you see in the risk policies within NASA?
Okay, NASA has level of emissions, and Class A mission, B, C, and D. I think I'd have to go do some research to remember the exact levels. So Class A is there's a risk to human life upon mission success, or it's so expensive that a loss of it would be a major. We spend a lot of money, major loss of a major investment, and a capability that we might need for national defense, if it's not NASA, or a capability that's critical, or a scientific capability that they've been working on for 20 years, and JWST is an example. So that's a Class A. Class B, it's not as costly if you lose it. There may be, human life may not be at risk, but the success of the mission might be. And then, Class C was, okay, the cost to mitigate the risk is so high that we're going to accept a certain level of risk. And if it happens, it happens. And the loss is not so much that it's going to be catastrophic. And Class D would be totally experimental. We're going up there, it may or may not survive. But if it does survive, but we're going to learn from it. In other words, it's a learning thing, and the next one we're going to learn from that. So it's totally a research level, and it could be 3 levels, and then mix them up. But point is that the concept of understanding the mission criticality, and then based on that, you establish the reliability level. I'll give you an example from Hubble, and I give you examples from the shuttle and others, even space station. But the one from Hubble is a good one. Hubble was going to be so long in development and so expensive that they wanted to make sure that for its 15-year life, they maximize the uptime. And what I mean by uptime is the amount of time, it's collecting photons. In other words, it's doing astronomy work, okay, of some one form or another. So when I looked at it, I did a study in 1969 and 1970. It's available someplace, but it was a summer study on large space telescope, okay, design, and basically they looked at it and said, how do I maximize the uptime? Well, and so they looked at how much reliability do I put in? What levels of failure? 1, 2, or 3? Do I, a single point failure, quad, or in the case of Apollo, it was a 4 quad. I forget what the quad redundancy. They had on many critical, on mission critical, not every component, but life critical components. They had quad redundancy. There was a standard design with electronics. I was an electronic guy. The standard design with electronics that you could tolerate a failure of any one of the 4 components. They were all redundant. They were wired in such a way you could tolerate any one failure and 1, 2, or even 3 and still be successful. But it's expensive. Nowadays, it's probably easier to implement, but it's expensive. So they looked at that and said, okay, and then you not only do it in the electronics, but you'll have 2 ways to do every function. In other words, some of the things you're doing never been done before. Okay, so this way may not be perfect. So I have 2 different functional redundancy, they call it, in 2 different ways, where I might have an analog device in there to measure something, and I might have a digital one or 2 different ways to do it, and either one will work, and the likelihood of both failing is small. Okay, so that's another thing you can do. But and it's the number of batteries I have, the number of gyros I have, all of it, and so it's spiraling, because the more components I put in, the heavier the vehicle is. The heavier the vehicle is, the more it costs to launch it, the harder it is to test. Redundancy isn't easy to test, because once you put it in, I want to execute a function that keeps working, and I don't know whether one or the 2 things failed. You can't always just make measurements to say, oh, that one's working, that one's not. Sometimes you can't tell because of the way, the particular component. If these electrical components were perfect examples. Well, I had 4 capacitors wired in a certain way, and they were mounted on a board, covered with conformal coating, and all I had is a wire coming in and a wire coming out. There was no way I could tell if one of those capacitors were failed. Okay? Or 2, for that matter. And they were, because of the way they were wired, if one failed, you might be able to you could maybe make a measurement, but I don't remember. But it was always a question of, how do we know all the redundancy is there at once? So the more redundancy you put in, harder. So having said that, what the summer study looked at, it decided that, okay, the optimum thing was to have a design life for the engineering components on Hubble of about 3 to 5 years, and it changed over time. But that's not important for this discussion. But and the way we're going to keep it alive is we're going to use the space shuttle to repair it, to be able to service it and repair it. The first concept was they were going to bring it to the ground. They were going to return it every 5 years and refurbish it. However, when I was on Hubble, not as the servicing guy, but I first joined NASA, I was the operation head of developing operations. That concept changed. And they decided that bringing it back would be a disaster. They would never get, the politics would never let them get off the ground. The scientists want to build a new telescope that's bigger and better, and not just clean this up and refurbish it. So they decided in the long run, so they just had a servicing mission programmed in every 3.5 years. And every 3 years, and so 5 of them designed it, and so they could put less redundancy on board, and therefore keep the weight down, keep the size down, and basically what you're doing is you're trading off redundant components for science capability. There's only so much weight you can put on board, such a size, and the less real estate used for engineering components, the more you can use for science components. So there's always that push to maximize the science. Later on in the Mars missions, we made some mistakes. we let the scientists drive the bus independently, and they went overboard and didn't put enough redundancy on it. We lost a couple of more observers, or one specifically because they did not allow enough real estate to put antennas on, so no matter where they landed, they could face the Earth, and they landed with the antenna pointed away from the Earth, and that was the end of the mission. The communications
What is the
antenna.
best compromise then? What would be the best compromise between redundancy and cost effectiveness and efficiency?
All of that is a big trade-off. That's what systems engineers do. Okay, there was a trade-off, and they looked at when the cost and the weight of redundancy degraded the mission. Okay, and they looked at that one inflection point, and then they said, well, now what are my variables to control that, to make it better? Okay, and they came up with the notion of servicing it. Now, I must admit, during that period of time, everybody was enamored with the space shuttle. It was at that time approved. Launching the Hubble Large Space Telescope was one of the design reference missions for the initial shuttle design and rationale for it, along with other large satellites. So the use of it for servicing was very attractive. And we had a guy, Frank Ceppolina, whose whole life has been servicing. I've known Frank since 1968. And I worked with him when I was at Grumman in those days, when he was a NASA guy. And I worked with him on both. We worked on the spacecraft for the OAO together. But at the same time, he was thinking ahead to, why don't we make these serviceable on orbit, take advantage of the shuttle? And we always had a little R&D program going on between Grumman and NASA Goddard on servicing system design, because in those days, you had to worry about thermal surfaces when you replaced the box. You didn't have heat pipes and some of the modern, newer technology to control thermal. And so the components are much more thermally dependent on getting rid of the heat and moving it around to get the cold side warm. And so you had thermal grease, and you had plates machined to 1/10,000th flatness across it. So you had full contact when you put it together. And all of those things. So how do you on orbit replace it? How do you put thermal grease on in zero gravity? All those things, they were fun. I mean, that was a fun time to start to think about those designs and what you did. And to his credit, he came up with many of the things that went into the design of Hubble, even though he was not involved in the design of Hubble. But they used his concepts. He was the head guy he worked for me. I worked for him for many years. He worked for me for many years. And we went back and forth a couple of times, in fact. But he was the brains behind the servicing mission as far as the hardware and all of he was the project manager for that part for me. I had an operations project, science project, and a development and servicing project underneath me. And he headed that up, and he came up with things that nobody would dare to do in space. And he went and convinced everybody we could do them, and did them. Boring through the insulation with a little hole to get in there and change out a piece of electronics that wasn't designed to be changed. It was inside an instrument, a little component board. Anyway, I could go on with some of the things that he pushed, but the point is, you look at what the mission objective is, and you at that point set back to the very first question. You set the number one. You got a cost boundary, of course. They're not unlimited. You got a cost boundary. You got a reliability of how many years I want it to work. Statistically, you can look at redundancy and come up with the number of years. Nowadays, with a lot more compute power and memory power on board, there's an awful lot of things you can do in software to provide redundancy around failed components. For example, when a gyro fails, if you've got if one axis, you lose one axis, you can use a combination of software, magnetometers on board, and other sensors to take the place of a failed gyro. And so you can do it with 2 gyros. We've proven you can do it with 3. Okay, you lose a little bit of accuracy each time, but you still can do great science. So my only point is that things have changed, but nevertheless, you make the decision. You look at how much money, time, etc. you want to spend in redundancy to get there. Then you start to look at what kind of test program you have, because how you test it is not only it's not only expensive, but it also can establish, validate reliability levels, validate the number of burn-ins you do, the length of the test program on the ground and thermal vacuum, for example, and stuff can start to take out what's called infant mortality, but things that for one reason or another fail. That at the end of the design is that such that it has a very small tolerance, and they might have, when they build it, it's at one end of the tolerance or the other, and you start to stress it, and you find those. But if you measure them on individually, the components, they're all within tolerance. When you put them together, you find out 2 of them are at the wrong end of the tolerance, and suddenly use them. Those are the kind of things you find in testing. And so the length of testing, all of that, we call it the LDs, reliability, testability, and all that stuff. You factor all that in to come up with a design solution that fits the cost model, on paper achieves the reliability. I mean, that's all you can do at that point, is analytically achieves the lifetime due to failures, statistical failures. And so that's kind of the process, and that's how you manage risk. And you decide how much you want to invest in the test program, and that might require unique special facilities. How much do you want to invest in it, depending on the program? How much do you want to invest in the facility to be able to do that? For example, Houston has a chamber in there that's rated for humans, so they could put a spacecraft in with humans inside it and test it. I mean, that came out of the Apollo program. The big problem with human spaceflight is, like space station, they're so big you can't test the whole thing on the ground. Where the satellite programs, you can. Hubble, JWST, they put in the Houston chamber. I mean, they were able to test it as the motto is test it as you fly it. Test it like you're going to fly it. That's the goal, is to get as close to the space environment as you can and see if make sure it works. And you can't do that with generally very large space structures that are typical of the human spaceflight program. So they have a different process they go through.
Is ever
They have a different.
Yeah, go on, please, if you want to.
Yeah, their process is much more about rigid control on requirements, rigid control on specifications, rigid control on making sure that every component meets that specification, and then testing at the highest level they can, making sure they test all the interfaces that they can actually have, simulate them well. And so it's a very costly process. But again, it's the only way to do it if human life's at risk. It's the only way to get the kind of reliability you need to ensure that.
Is there a way, first of all, to pioneer servicing in space? Because we know it is a very tricky concept. I think the Hubbard service mission proved that it is very tricky. And on a secondary note, I wanted to understand also, I think it's important to understand the impact on the planet. People have been talking about space junk and the effect we have on our planet for decades now. I think there was a graphic showing basically it looks like a mist around Earth. It is tons of them, and it is very difficult to take that space junk and bring it on Earth and recycle it. So let's start with the first strand. Do you think there is a way to pioneer servicing in space? How easy can we make it to the point where it is something expected?
Yeah. Okay, I'll give you two stories.
Yeah.
This same guy, Frank Ceppolina, came up with a concept. It was called the multi-mission spacecraft. I was part of the design team on that. And what he did was he designed it. Well, there was always let me just stick with this theme.
Yeah.
Remember I talked earlier about the thermal interfaces and the complexity of all that. So he got what he concluded, and he actually developed a prototype by hook and crook. I mean, he didn't have a lot of money. He concluded that if I modularize the subsystem, he created a center structure with three modules. One was the electrical power subsystem, the other was the communications and data handling subsystem, and the third was the stabilization and control. And those are the three primary systems. And they made it, I think they were boxes. Each one was about 4 foot by 4 foot. They went on a triangular structure, one on each side. They had a connector that was self-mating. You know, it swiveled and fit into a funnel, and one bolt. So his concept was the space shuttle would come up there, they would put it on the end of the arm, the astronaut would get out there, undo one bolt, pull off the saddlebag, put a new one on. So you replaced it a subsystem at a time. So that was built into the design from the get-go. In other words, so it made it serviceable on orbit. At a very simple thing. We actually flew 10 of them, and it worked. I mean, Solar Max was the first one in 1984. I think, yeah, 1984. Again, I was the ops manager for Solar Max, and I had just joined NASA for Space Telescope. I left Grumman and joined NASA during that mission. I was, you know, had an involvement in it from NASA, but since the ops manager, we developed a lot of we worked with SEPI as the contractor to develop the operations for that first service mission. But the design, what was built into the design, we built into the design serviceability. Fast forward, that had things like fiduciary marks, so you could look at with crosshairs, and so when you mated the arm to it, you went to a grapple fixture that was put on it. So that if that didn't have a grapple fixture, it would be much more bigger challenge to capture it. Fast forward, they tried to do that a couple of years later with a communication satellite. They tried to capture it, and it wasn't designed to be serviced. They had this big, long arm. It was, I want to say, 8 feet, and on the end it had some almost like vice grip. You know, when a vice grip was a flipper plate, but it was wider. It was more like a canvas pull if you haven't done any canvas stretching for art. And so it was more like that. And it was at the end, and they tried to make it well. They didn't do it successfully. They ended up sending astronauts to grab it, you know, take a high risk. It was really a high risk thing, something to do, but they did it. But the point is that wasn't designed for servicing. Fast forward, there's a number of companies out there today who are two things. They're designing spacecraft to be serviced in both of, and putting things on like being able to attach a module that gives you more fuel, that extends the life, that also brings power to take care of degraded solar rays. Loral, I guess what the Maxor is their new name, but that Loral is a pioneer in that. Their communication satellites are now designed such that they can refuel them, and there was now companies out there. That's why I said the government cut that down. There's companies out there now capable of delivering fuel and refueling a satellite in orbit. I always believed that there was room to have, in effect, coal gas and a hydrazine gas station on orbit. You know, a refueling station on orbit parked up there that could be used sending out tugs or some way to be used to transfer fuel to satellites. I believe you're going to see that in the next 10 years, or they'll use other technology besides.
Do you believe it is sustainable?
Propeller. Pardon me?
Is it sustainable to have a refueling station in orbit, or does it create any risk initially? It is a technology that has never been tested, has it?
Yeah, the concept has been tested.
The concept has been
not
tested.
having a station sitting there, but bringing up with the shuttle. I forget, some couple of different experiments. This, especially when you're dealing with not hypergolics, but the cryogenic propellants like hydrogen stuff. How you get that to transfer even in zero gravity, you know, because it's just a blob. How do you get it? Well, they use bladders. You know, they use bladders. They pressurize the outside around the bladder, but they have demonstrated that in orbit. There are currently satellites that have attached modules attached that have propellant in them, and in those, it's just as easy to have. If you design it, it's just as easy to have thrusters if that's what you're using. Little, on that module to do your propulsion, and just have electrical connection and be able to communicate it with it. But nowadays you can use Bluetooth in orbit. Well, I don't know if it's reliable, but they use it on space station. You can use Bluetooth and wireless on orbit. I mean, there's no reason why you can't. And in fact, so my point is they don't always have to have wires for connectivity. So there's a lot of work going on that a lot of companies that form just to do that, and have been demonstrating that. Then they have a company that you don't need propellant to move yourself from one orbit to another. You don't need a kick stage. They have a company that has a tug, and they move you and put you in your orbit. So these are companies that are out there right now doing some early stage, but they're doing commercial work. They're beyond experimenting. So going back to your other question, you have to, if you want your satellite service, the easiest way to do it is make sure you do some fundamental things in the design. The very first one is have some, what I would call fiduciary marks, but have some way when a vehicle is approaching it that's going to service it, that it locks onto some things to allow it to properly seat on the grapple or however you're going to attach to it. Okay, you have to have that. If you don't have that, then the way it's been done, and we've demonstrated it, but it's not a practical way to continue, is you take pictures of it that you take before launch. Every satellite has pictures of it, and you put those pictures in a computer, digitize them, and you do pattern matching, and then you make that way. I mean, Maxor, I think they bought, I'm not sure, but Space Dev up in Canada developed that concept, and they were trying to use it on the Hubble, the last Hubble repair mission. I wouldn't let them. I was on the review committee, and I actually testified in front of Congress because it wasn't mature enough, and we had a time frame by which we needed to do the repair mission, or we had no batteries. So the batteries were gone. So we basically went back with the shuttle. That was right after Columbia, when they weren't going to go back with the shuttle. And the committee I was on, we turned it around. I feel good about that. We convinced first NASA and then Congress that the right thing to do was service Hubble one more time with the shuttle.
Do you think that servicing can be revolutionized by having completely remote unmanned missions? We're in an era now where AI is booming.
Yeah.
Is it desired, though, to have unmanned servicing or remote servicing?
Well, let's think about this. You mentioned something, risk. Well, yeah. One of the highest risks is the loss of human life. If I can do something without risking a human life, that's the right way to do it. If I can't do it, and cost, is not really a factor, because you can't say, $10 million it's going to cost me, or risk one human life. I mean, I don't care what the number is. You can't. There's no way you can tell the story as I'm risking this guy's life to save money, right? If something happens, there's no way. What do you say at the trial? There's nothing you could ever say at the trial to justify that. Is the way my question whenever you make an operations decision is, what do you say at the trial if it doesn't work? Did I have a reason for doing this? There was no other way to do it, then you could. If there was another way to do it, you have a good reason why you didn't do that. And it can't be because it cost me 20 cents more. So anyway, so the answer is yes. I think remote servicing, yes, there are companies working on it. We could not get NASA, and I was a part of a bunch of thorns in people's side to add servicing capability to JWST. Number one, it's at the Lagrange point 1 million miles away, so humans haven't been there. But there was no reason why they couldn't go there. I mean, you could take the Dragon module, the space ISS module and send it out there. You could do that if you wanted to. But there is but again, that's sending humans there. So at the last minute, Ceppolina, he convinced him to put a grapple. That's the only way to shut him up. He was going to keep going. He works by going to the press first, and then asking permission second, and then falling on his sword third. I mean, I can give you a story. This guy is a legend for doing things like that.
Is that a true story?
Oh yeah, Hubble. In the case of, yes, there's a grapple on him. In the case of Solar Max, it was designed to be serviced. Ceppolina knew that, but nobody else in the agency really cared much about that. Engineers like to build new things. They don't want to be fixing. Nobody wanted to be repairman. But Seppi designed this thing, and they didn't even want to use this. It was a multi-mission spacecraft designed to service, to be the bus for 10 or 12 different missions. Most project managers didn't want to. Long story. I was involved in trying to get all the projects to use it. We actually ended up flying it 8 times, so eight different configurations, and saved the government a lot of money, including other agencies used it. But there was still a reluctance every time a guy got named the project manager. What can I build? How can I? But so anyway, but the point is, back to that. It's about humans, so about automation. So Seppi, so that's a true story. But when it came back to how did you ask me? I lost my train of thought. I got myself distracted.
I can repeat it. So it is basically, if we can revolutionize servicing using AI, so unmanned missions, completely remote servicing, we mentioned it is desired because the biggest order loss is human life, basically. But you said it is more than desired when we move on into this digitalization era, 2024 and onwards.
I think it's, to me, I think that's where we're headed. We have to. There's a human mission, even forget about the risk, the cost of putting together a human mission and all of the testing you do and the training of the astronauts and all of that stuff is huge. If you think about it, if I can create, like we do with like fluid dynamics, computational fluid dynamics, where I create an environment, and the bigger the supercomputer, the more nodes I had, and then I fly my airplane through it, and all in simulation. I get very accurate performance numbers on wings of different shapes and fuselages and things like that. So creating an environment that represents, number one, space, but number two, different satellite designs. Is when you go to the communication satellites, for example, there are only so many designs. They're all not that unique. You know what I mean? There's not everyone. They may be custom in the number of transponders, may be custom in the latest technology. But if I start in terms of what the power system on a transponder, the design of it. But if I start to think about servicing them, I can start to think about some standardization of the interfaces at the levels such that I can now create a simulation of that on the ground and actually do whatever I need to do and train operators and remote people that are engaged on doing that to a very high degree of accuracy. And I can start adding new satellite designs to it as they come out within the willingness of companies to share their proprietary information. And I can do a pretty high reliability simulation training and for a far cheaper cost than setting up some kind of human training and all of that. And I can begin, at some point, I'm going to have a catalog, and people are going to like, oh, I'm going to save money on my satellite. I'm going to design so it, meets the interfaces in the servicing catalog. I mean, that's the way to, the way the world works in aviation components, right? Space components is you want to make your design minimize the cost and maximize the reliability. You start to conform to things that I can use this component that's formed 100 times before. There's no reason I need to change anything. So they start to. So I think you can do the same. There's no reason why you wouldn't do the same thing. If there was an environment that I could service something, I would design so that those interfaces were there, so it could be serviced. Even if I initially, I'm not sure I'm going to service it. It's good insurance. It's good insurance because things change over time, and there are a number of areas that was done. It was the MMS was a perfect example. Right? Once again, there were 12 missions that could use it in various configurations, but all of them were ultimately serviceable on orbit if they needed to be. It was a concept before its time. Also, there weren't a lot of controls on how the decision process was made in those days that are there today. And if that existed today, more and more project managers would be forced to use it. That when I said the review process, they really have to prove they couldn't use the MMS. But previously, it was, is it how could a persuaded the project manager was to his boss whether he needed to go use something off the shelf or whether he had, and they were very creative in way. And technology was far different. Technology was a lot more hardware oriented in the 80s and the 80s and 90s. That today, again, software, the amount of memory, the amount of compute power you have on orbit is leaps and bounds above what would factors of 1,000, not factors of 10, but factors of 1,000, maybe even more. In fact, the compute power on Hubble, they changed over time with the servicing mission just by changing out chips, not big piece of hardware. I think if I remember right, it was 1,000 times the collection power for the instruments because they could store higher speed collection, storage, and more importantly, readout, getting it to the ground. So
just to clear something up as well. So the MMS is the magnetospheric multiscale mission to understand how the magnetic fields of Sun and Earth interact. Correct?
Could you repeat that? I'm having trouble following you.
Yeah. So you mentioned the MMS. That is the magnetospheric multiscale mission to understand how the magnetic field of the Earth and the Sun connect.
Right.
Right. Okay. I just wanted to clear
No,
this up.
no, that's not
Yeah.
MMS. MMS is not the same. That is also a mission, and that may have even used the MMS. MMS was multi-mission spacecraft. I'm sorry.
Okay. Just got my acronyms
Multi-mission
confused.
yeah. SolarMax, URs, EUVE. I can't remember all the missions that used it, but there were about 8 missions plus a couple of Navy missions, if I remember right, maybe even an Air Force one that used it. And again, it was the way the technology was packaged. It was designed from inception for servicing, and that's.
It is, I think, great insights.
Let me stop. The example I was going to give you about Ceppolino was when MMS. What happened is another story, but the reaction wells, the fuses blew on the reaction wheels, and it was a design problem, one at a time. And so when the third one went, it went into a very controlled by the magnetometer mode that pointed roughly in the direction of the sun in those days, and there was at least 1 or 2 instruments that could actually collect data. And then CEPI proposed, why don't we service it? That's what it was designed for. Designed with that in mind. All we have to do is change out the module. And NASA looked at it, let's go build another satellite. The mentality was, Why do we want to do that? That's it. We knew we got brand new technology, new instruments, great. Now that we learned, and Seppi pushed. Well, he pushed by going to the press and telling the world that we're going to service solar back after NASA said no. After NASA said no, he went to the he went and put pressure. And then he went to Congress. He called up the local congressman and told him, this is it. It needs to be done. That was what the shuttle was for. And NASA had no choice at some point between the press and the Congress. They had to say, we're looking at how to service it. I mean, what are they going to say? No, we're not going to do it. I mean, number one, he'll argue that they paid the money to build a spacecraft that was designed for servicing. The shuttle's mission is to service. This is an easy, fairly easy, straightforward, low risk thing to do. And so he got it done by, starting with getting the external pressure put on the agency. And he didn't get fired.
It is one of those people who can go and defy governments and massive corporations just because they are extremely knowledgeable and they are very personable. He has two attributes, which engineers, I think, nail rarely. We're very logical.
He's one of these guys who, if he believes something is right and believes it the right thing to do, he never really did anything personally for himself. This is not a guy who did anything to grow his stature in life or position or make more money. He had plenty of opportunities to do that. He never did that. That wasn't his motivation. His motivation is he believed this was the most interesting and best thing to do. There's pros and cons to servicing. Servicing does require, at least previously, now things are changing, but it did require back in the 80s, a large infrastructure on the ground that was costly to maintain to have the capability to service, when you needed it. And a lot of the scientists looked at that as, that's money taken away from a new mission. You got this down just in case you need it, and I want to start a new mission. Well, it's not just in case. We knew we were going to need it because we allowed us to upgrade the Hubble. They didn't, other disciplines who weren't optical astronomers, infrared astronomers, X-ray astronomers, they wanted to build the next and greatest X-ray guy. And the minute money was being spent on servicing, they looked at it as taken away from their thought. I mean, the science community is very well known for once they have a problem, they surround the problem like the wagon trains going out west. They surround the problem and then they shoot in instead of shooting out. They immediately they want to take the other guy's money to solve their problem. Their problem is more pressing or important. So anyway, but the point is the scientific community in general did not support servicing because they always looked at it as a big overhead. On the other hand, look at what Hubble's done, and there is no way for the money invested in that you would have got the science back if you didn't have servicing. If you couldn't build five Hubbles or 3 Hubbles to upgrade them with the kind of measurements it was capable of making as a result of the last servicing mission were so far ahead of what was even conceived at launch that they launched 18 years before that when it was designed, 30 years before that. Anyway, but yeah, Seppi's the kind of guy. I mean, he used to come into Grumman when I worked there, and he'd come in with. He thought, he's the government. He's not supposed to be going out to the drafting boards and the design stations and telling the engineers what to do, but he did. That's how I got to know him. My job when he would come to Grumman, my job was to meet him at the door and keep him under control, which was, pretty impossible, but I did. I mean, we could give you Hubble supplemental stories all day. That's a book in itself.
I think he deserves an interview. to be honest. So if he's around.
Yeah, I just had lunch with him 2 weeks ago. So just before I went on that No, it was after I came back. I came back. Yeah, a week and a half ago. Yeah, I had lunch with him. Yeah,
I am
we
extremely
get
curious
together.
as a person.
All the Hubble guys get together about every 2 months for lunch over at a local little Italian restaurant by the Goddard.
It
If the
is.
astronauts come, everybody comes.
I am extremely curious. I think at this stage, you know that
Uh,
if there is if there is an opportunity and he's willing to talk on his side of the story, I'd be more than glad to listen to it. But it's up to you and him if you want to do something
yeah,
like
I'll
that.
talk to him. I'll see him our next luncheon isn't until June, unfortunately. Next time I'll see him.
I think one of the greatest virtues is patience, Joe. So
He is.
from my part, it's completely fine.
Yeah. Okay.
Perfect. It is incredible, sincerely, that every single time I talk to you, the more things I understand that I don't know. I came into the interview initially with an extremely open mind, willing to learn, of course. And by the second time we spoke, I thought, okay, now I know a lot. And here I am, third time, and I'm thinking, don't really know anything, do I? I have a
No,
lot to learn.
that's not true. That's not true.
That's how I treat myself. Maybe it's too strict.
Well, I interact a lot with the young, when I was skybox with people in their 20s and 30s, and I keep looking at them and say the same thing you do. I don't know anything. These guys, things that change. If you're not learning every day in your life, then probably that isn't a good day. You got to learn something. It doesn't mean it's all technology or all, but you're
Oh, yeah.
learning something. I've done since I had a little more time when I came back from California about 7 years ago. I joined the book club. Why would I join a book club? Well, some friend of my wife said, "Hey, why don't you come to lunch with?" Well, and he said, "Don't panic. We spend 2 hours eating and drinking and 10 minutes talking about the book." Well, the point is the books we've reading, but I have learned more about history, and there are a lot of them about the history from all different perspectives, from Russia's perspective, from England. I learned I had really about Churchill and the Ungentlemanly War. I don't know. It's a real fun read, especially in technology. If you ever read it, I probably have it here someplace. But anyway, the point was,
I'll
I don't
go and
know.
look it up. I'm always in the
Yeah,
hunt for
it was
something interesting to read. Yeah.
the precise name of it is, I think, Winston Churchill and the Ungentlemanly War. I have it on my phone, is where I have it. But a great book about a lot of events that happened that, if you know anything about the Second World War, especially Britain's involvement, Britain, what happened to Britain. All of a sudden, these things, you suddenly realize what was behind, why they happened, and how that. I mean, the fundamental basis of the book, without giving it away, is that the Reserve British military believed they wanted to do everything kind of by the rules of war. Okay. And
Mm-hmm.
meanwhile, the Hitler and company doing everything. They didn't care. They're killing people, or in prison. All the atrocities, and just the bombing of London, and and yet these guys they wanted to keep their agenda. And Churchill had a whole separate group of people that did some, equally not. They really didn't do. They invented, for example, the mine that you attach to the submarine hull, you know, and things like that were part of war. You got a submarine out there that shoot your ship. You can either risk lives and ships trying to kill it, or you can go send the diver in with a thing, get rid of it. And so they were all reasonable things. But then some of the deceptions, and you can read the book, but the point, one of the ones is the Allies invaded Sicily, and that may be aware of that, and then that's how they won, get the Italians. So, but the story behind that is this group that Churchill formed spent 2 years creating the deception to do that. one of the things they did, they had to create a perfect deception. So they had a downed airman who got killed. So they used his body and put a set of plans in the pocket about invading, I think it was Greece, invading Greece. And
My country.
this was
Yeah.
what the big, you may have heard the story. And I mean,
Yes,
but
that's where I come from.
that,
Greece is my country, so yes.
yeah, that was just a little bit of it. I mean, they had the whole deception and the planning and everything. And then, the Germans went and beefed up, Greece, and they invaded Sicily and walked in, and they were greeted with pizzas, and they got on with it. But seriously,
Yeah.
it's a good book. But some of the coming along, some of the technologies and how they developed it and tested it and stuff is really good. I think it's Winston Churchill and the Ungentlemanly War, I think, is the name of the book. Let me
I
just
look
really give it one
how
second.
you
I'll let you go. I have the
yeah.
name of it right here because I have it as an ebook. But anyway,
Yeah.
this book club, just participating in this book club, I have learned so much about the war, about things that I was aware on the surface, a little bit about, and learned a lot. And then a lot about, what people went through who actually lived through it. I mean, a lot of things we read are biographies. And now we've got one guy, just a couple of authors are on the club. One guy was in the Hanoi Hilton, in Vietnam with Senator McLean and that bunch of what he went through as a shot down pilot. He wrote a book, and that was intriguing. We got another guy who was a reporter, frontline for CNN, a frontline reporter that went over there with the Marines when in Iraq, and and then he wrote a book 20 years later of visiting the same Marines he was with and what they were doing today. That's a kind of interesting book called Battle Scars. But books.
That is why I started this platform, even though I haven't been exposed into everything naturally as a young person. I just knew I don't know enough, and I have to do something to get an edge over, I think, my peers. It started as something very competitive in me. Now I think it has matured into going deep and understanding how the world functions through my interviews, through interviewing people like you. But I am at a point where every single time I think, is there going to come a point where I really deeply know how the world functions in every single discipline or business um, space? And I've concluded that no, it is not going to happen.
Well, the point is, it's changing. Also, I mean, it's
Yeah,
evolving,
yeah,
and and maybe some of it's evolving that we don't see, and it's not going to surface for maybe years. Okay, there
yeah,
are an awful lot of the thing that I've learned, and I know of some of them firsthand. I have never personally been engaged with them, but I do know of people who have and have talked to them. But there's in the United States and some I know are international, where there's this conclave where a bunch of influential people go off for a week or a weekend um, to just discuss ideas, play golf. But some of them are nefarious, plotting things. Like they want to control the economy or something. Others are political in nature. Different parties in the United States, different political parties, but they're very influential people come to this, and they um, and these things exist, and I can't tell you whether they meet once a year or 10 times a year. I don't know, but I
yeah,
do know
yeah.
people who went, and I've never had the opportunity, nor even I'm not sure I'd feel comfortable in that environment. Just not me. Anyway, it's Churchill's Ministry of Ungentlemanly War.
Ministry of Ungentlemanly War. Well,
Written by Giles Milton, Giles Milton, Milton. It's an interesting read. That's all. You may you may have learned all of this
mm,
in school. I don't know, but for us it was an interesting read. There's so many, but a lot of books like that. But again, learning, I've learned so much from these books about the world, and but again, a very narrow No, poor. I can't get them. Every time I bring a space related book, and they read it, they boo it. They basically there's only about a dozen of us, but I hesitate to recommend the book because every time I mean I got lots of books back here that I'd love them to read, but I they're different kind of people. They're a couple of them are farmers. I got one that's a farrier, a horse guy, takes care of, well known in the area, the horse guy. Another's a television reporter. Couple of doctors. It's a diverse group of people.
Mhm.
But I'm the only space guy.
And I believe you're a book in itself, Joe. I think that those interviews act for me also as a notebook. So as I go through my career, my personal development, I find myself always going back to the interviews I do and just getting advice. So it only makes sense for me to just keep them as a notebook as well, and judge my actions against what I have learned through people like you.
Yeah,
Uh,
it's getting you feeling comfortable with a mentor and not feeling you have to
oh
know
yes,
the. Yeah, I mean, too
yes,
many people. Me, one of them, felt I always had to know, and I. But mentors can tell you everything from how to dress when you go to a meeting, and that's not less important now. But years ago, and how to act, and who the key guy, who the guy in there when he speaks, you listen to him, and who the guy when he speaks, you listen to him, but don't take any action based on what he says, and you know, one of
absolutely.
the things when I took over Goddard, I was unique. I was the only one who ever grew up at Goddard. Both of them. I had held almost every imaginable kind of job at Goddard, except the gate guard. A project manager, contractor, an operations guy, a design guy, a launch guy. So and so, but one thing I did was able to do is I built up people that I worked with for at that point it was 64, 30 years, people that I worked with for 30 years and just little snippets, but we all worked together on one program and then they fanned out and then I got to work with them again. So when I became senator, I knew who the real influences were on the Senate versus the managers, the formal managers versus the influences. And that's important to know who really people look to when there's some radical things going on or some things that you've never seen before, and who do they look to for ground truth, solid input, uh, and who in today's jargon, it's who are the influences. The influences are not necessarily the management, the formal line management. There are people.
Mhm.
There was one guy at Goddard who was the go-to guy for a certain kind of technology, detective technology. There was another. There were people around there, and they were all in terms of engineering and approaches and stuff, and they really had a following, and they were also looked at as a form of management. So not only did they influence the technical side of it, but they influenced how the rest of the center lined up around new ideas. They were people that looked to when a new idea came in. When I wanted to reorganize the center, you know, they would. There was one guy came to me and said, and he was in it. He says, "I'm going to help you do this." He said, "and then I'm going to retire." He said, "I believe what you're doing is right. It's contrary to what we've been doing for 30 years, but it's time, and you got it for the right reason." And he was a guy that I worked for 25 or 30 years before, but he popped up out of the, and I knew he was always one of the influences in certain areas in Goddard. And but he came to me, and I knew when he did that, it got me the whole engineering directorate behind what I was doing because they would listen to this guy. They would come to him. He would be the first guy they'd come to and say, "Oh, look what they're making me do." Because he'd been around so long, he was very innovational. He was always one step ahead of the current technology, looking ahead. He was, flying flight computers when people were just thinking about what if we could. He was actually had some up there being tested. So he was that kind of guy in many areas. Not only that,
think it takes quite an organization to have those hotspots in. Of course, I have my career spans a fraction of yours, but I think that these people exist in specific industries where they're very driven, very motivated, and they understand the common purpose. Because in an industry where people they just want a job per se, for instance, let's say accounting, something very simple, something on top of my head, it's more difficult to find hotspots and people who are influential. Maybe in their own capacity they are, but I think we have to understand that there is more impactful industries than others. I think Goddard in itself, its vision allowed for those kind of people to be there. As I understand it was way more than just that person you mentioned.
Yeah, why? There's a reason. There's at least not a reason, but there's some organizational, structural reasons that Goddard, people at Goddard, there were people like that. Number one, they're a government organization. They're not measured by how much money they make. They're not measured by EBITDA and all the parameters that a business is measured. Number two, civil servants are they're there for life. I mean, they can't fire them. Okay, we had civil servants who didn't do anything. You know, they were retired in place, and we couldn't fire them. You know, we used some techniques later on to get rid of them when I got there, but they were there retired in place. And even when I was running a division, I moved a lot of people around because I wanted to get the people that are retired in place in an organization, then they could abolish the organization. And if you abolish the organization, they could in effect be fired. It gave them a little bit of money to leave, but and people, as soon as I put that organization, there were people who really all of a sudden realized what I was doing and said, okay, I'll sign up for that new job. I mean, it really did. But anyway, going back, so the government guys, you know, they don't have to worry about their job. They can, in many cases, make a decision on what they work on. If they can get a funding source, they can apply for research. Scientists especially, they can apply for research funding in some pretty esoteric things. I give you examples. So there's a lot more freedom, and there again, when it comes to, there are people who put together teams to do something. You know, hey, I need a power guy, I need a thermal guy, but we're going to come up with this new concept, and then we're going to package it, and we're going to use it to bid on the next announcement of opportunity that comes out for a mission. Okay, and this guy would be the guy who'd be looking ahead and saying, if we had this kind of technology, we could do that. And then he'd use that to sell the idea to the scientist, and somebody would get to follow him, and pretty soon there'd be a mission proposed. And there were a number of missions that came out of Goddard that in this particular guy that came out of his, because he envisioned his big contribution was communications and onboard data systems, where they used to be the constraint on the size of the detector, how much information you could get down in an orbit, all sorts of things. He came up with advanced concepts of that and said, by funding these and getting these in place, we open up a whole new class of missions of science in terms of Earth remote sensing, real-time data, getting it to the ground in a timely manner, not having to wait weeks, getting it corrected on orbit in the flight computers rather than sending it to the ground and having to correct it and humans involved. There was all sorts of things that he would enable by doing that. And he had the vision to see that. And so once he started to come out with those, I mean, there were the traditional guys who would call him, crazy, and we don't want to get involved with him, and I'm not going to get tied with him. He never delivers. But then there were the guys that the missions that were enabled because of his ideas, who and they were disciples, and that was the fact was a lot more than the fiction. The people who didn't want to deal with him were all hypothetical. This is why. But what he delivered. And I worked with him when I watched him, overcome some pretty big obstacles to get what he needed put in place to recovering from a failure and doing a redesign. And that was when I worked for him, and he was able to, muddle through all of the criticisms of, why are we even doing it again, be able to come out the other end and come out with a product that really delivered. So
we discussed this before, but the outcome from our previous sessions was that this business requires people who are resilient to criticism and resilient to failure and are able to recover from those failures.
I mean, that's how people are measured.
Yeah.
Yeah.
On the recovery pace.
But how you respond to adversity versus.
Yeah.
But that's what people remember you versus even if you caused the adversity. Even if you were if you were part of the team or caused it, if you responded to it by, this is what I did, this is how it happened, and this is what's needed to fix it, and I'm gonna, help in any way I can. Not be presumptuous, but I gotta fix it because nobody might want to let you behind the wheel of the car again. But the point is, people are measured, their integrity, their how they stand up from failure, and even if their failure was a total embarrassment to them, if they can stand up and say, I've learned from that and this is what I'm doing going forward, that gets respected. But what happens more importantly is over time, people don't remember the cause. They remember the success in recovering from it or the impact that it had. It's like Hubble. Far and far, people are less talking ever about the flawed mirror. They're always talking about all the amazing things it's doing. And so that equation flipped around, it actually flipped around, believe it or not, about halfway through the work for the repair mission. In other words, when people started, because we started this campaign of what Hubble can do, that was one of the first things we set as a priority when we started to fix, is not only work on the fix, but what can we do with Hubble? We found it could do outstanding science. In fact, get very close to what it was initially designed for across the board. It just took a little longer. Integration times on spectroscopy took a little longer, but if I allowed the extra, 10%, 20% of time for each observation, I was getting the same resolution quality that I expected to get in a perfect mirror. The imaging, the stuff that's most noticeable, from the distortion from the aberration of the mirror, that was correctable with software. We didn't even know that software existed at launch. It existed in another agency for other reasons, but there was optical correction that operated on the wavefront and reconstructed the wavefront, took out irregularities in it, and produced an image that was pretty close to perfect. and so we were doing it. So now we started to put out science, and all of a sudden people were awed with the imagery that was coming from Hubble. And it used to start out, the first sentence was, the Hubble, which was launched with the, flawed mirror, go into the disaster, is now returning some images. Then it turned out, in spite of the flawed mirror, it's returning. And then after a while, by the middle of year two, there was no longer in spite of. Hubble did this, Hubble did that. I watched that. And we were watching that change. It went from, because people forgot. And then all of a sudden, when we were doing it, we were taking a risk. And the public loves risk takers.
Oh, yes.
That it's a whole set of
the underdogs, yes. They love them.
Yeah. So we're taking a risk. And, we didn't think we were taking a risk. We certainly there was a possibility of failure, but we were confident that we did everything we could for success and we'd have success. And you have to do that. You have to prepare for failure, but you have to work as if you're going to be successful. So
incredible lessons.
Anyway, so I do believe that history remembers, and that's even how you have an argument with your other half, and it pretty soon it's okay. How did I get out of the argument? If one person stands up and says, "Okay, you win," or and when I went forward, pretty soon you don't even remember why you had the argument, right? That was, it's only a matter of time. It's how you responded. But if you respond by continually jabbing the other person, you'll be remembered in a different way.
It is incredible that you're applying engineering thinking into your relationship, and I think it has worked very well for you.
Yes, dear. I
Uh,
mean, I had a very limited vocabulary. Yes, dear. Certainly, Francis. Those 4 words get you through everything. If you
I
only
will
use
take
those
that
four
lesson.
words, you have 60 years of marriage. That's a.
I'll take that lesson. Joe, I don't know what I will do with the interview in the context of I'm not expecting you to sit down for 5 hours and watch the content. I will make it and send it to you just because I have to, basically, but I'm not expecting you to go through it. And I don't
Well,
think you said something you didn't want to be placed out there, but yeah, it's up to you.
no, I don't care. I mean, I'd be happy to look at it. To me, the only thing
Yeah.
I would worry about is not what you said, but make sure that there's anything in there that was not correct. That I either you misunderstood me or I misstated at the time. That was
Okay.
factually, not opinion wise, but factually. You know,
Yes, and also we've gone into incredible detail of the functions and structure and problem-solving abilities within NASA. I expect that there is no issue with placing that out there in the context of somebody coming back to you and telling you, well, why did you say this in an interview? I don't think so.
no, nothing I've said. No, I mean, no, I mean, if that's why I said I want to make sure that it's correct,
Yes, yes,
and I
yes,
said it,
yeah.
and the interpreter. That's all bad. Nothing I said. NASA's an open book. I mean, if everybody, it's not. There's not a lot I said that everybody doesn't. Somebody doesn't know. Nobody knows everything, and I don't know everything
Oh,
either.
yes.
Yeah, but the point is, no, I'm not worried about that at the moment. After I read it, I may, but I,
Perfect. Okay. I will scrutinize the material anyways, and I will flag up any points that I might think are important for you maybe to watch twice or something like that. But thank you for being so open and approachable, helping people
oh,
around the
you're
globe
welcome.
because I'm a complete stranger to you, so you didn't have to spend that much time with me. You did it anyways. It's a testament to
Oh,
your
I enjoy
character.
it. I enjoy sharing, and I relive them as it's kind of nice memories to have. I think I
Mhm.
told you, and relates to something you said earlier, but I always think that my 60 years I went to work 3 years, and the other 57 years I couldn't wait to get in there every day. But those 3 years, unfortunately, come a day here, day here, they scattered through it. But
Yeah, yeah.
I really never really went to work. For the most part, I went in to do something I enjoyed doing. I went in when I didn't have to. I went in the weekends, went in early, went in night. My family and my wife helped enable that. I mean, she supported me and put up with me. And when I took on Hubble, she said, "Okay, that's the last time I'm going to see you for dinner for 3 years," and it was pretty close.
You've got an incredible career and an incredible life. You're true. I think people who enjoy doing something so much to the point where they don't feel as if they need vacation, they're truly blessed. They are rare
Yeah,
and they're blessed.
yeah, oh, yeah. I for many years I had. I mean, I retired with the maximum number of vacation days on the books when I
I don't
uh,
think you've really retired, to be honest, at heart, at least.
well, when I left NASA, when
Yeah,
I
yeah.
left Grumman. I left Grumman. I had 17. I was with them 17 years. I had 17 weeks of unused vacation. And the rule at Grumman was,
17 weeks.
you lost, but they ended up paying me for them, and they didn't like that. The reason they didn't like the delay because they paid me at what I was making 17 years later, even though I was making quite a bit less money when it started. I mean, that's the way it worked. And I was a liability. I wasn't the only one. I mean, people really enjoyed it. I remember I got a new boss, and I had been where he looked and he looked at the hours and days I was working, and he decides he says, "I've got to do something for you." Well, I'm having fun, and I was in the proposal world at that time, and that wasn't as much fun. But the point was, so what do you do? He gives me 2 weeks vacation, another 2 weeks vacation. He didn't go bother check and found that I still had vacation I hadn't used from years before. He
You
gave me
know
two
you've
weeks
reached where
vacation.
your boss adds vacation to you and tells you, please leave the office, leave for 2 weeks. We don't want you here anymore. Come on.
No, I never
It's
had that.
incredible.
I never had that. In those days, we were always working towards some kind of deadline, either a launch. And when you're in space, a funny story that off the record, but not right. When I worked at Google, when Google took us on, they did not understand the mentality of space people for a lot of reasons, a lot of planes. But the big one was we're 6 weeks before 6 or 8 weeks before the launch. I probably this was August. It was 6 or 8 weeks before. It was about 3 months before the launch of the constellation, and it was what we were bought for. That was the pinnacle. We had a fixed launch date. We were, knocking down problems here and there to make sure ground software, everything is getting ready. People are working, 7 days a week, and nobody's complaining. They're all working. And I get a letter from an email and then follow up from the senior vice president. She had about 4,000 people under her, and she says, "We're all going on a mandatory 3-day retreat at Yosemite." And I said, "I'm asking people to work, 7 days a week, to get ready for this launch. There are certain things that we need people who don't want to be there, but they got to be, and then they're working. And now you're telling me I got to give everybody, everybody's going to take 3 days off and go to Yosemite and go fishing." I mean, that's what it was. We went fishing. We went, and so after much argument, she finally said, "Will there be a period between now and your launch that this might be acceptable?" I said, "Well, if we get everything done by the time we have to ship it to the launch site in French Guiana," I said, "that might be a good time." And she said, "Are you going to have people in French Guiana?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Well, I want them there. I want to give them." She thought she was trying to be nice and give everybody a fun time. She wasn't doing it for any other reason. And I said, "You want me to get people to come back from French Guiana to go to Yosemite for 3 days? Why don't I send them to Buenos Aires?" And she said, "Well, that's our policy." And I said, "Well," I said, she said, "Money's no object. I'll fly them first class." And that was what Google was, not that very food, but that was. And so we finally compromised, and we didn't bring the people back from Brazil, or French Guiana, and we went on a. Everybody, the rest of the team, all went to Yosemite. And not only that, I told them that the other thing is they're working 7 days a week, and they don't get to see their families. And now you're telling them their time off. Everybody might not want to go to Yosemite and fly fish and horseback ride and whatever other rock climbing and every other thing they had on the agenda. And I said,
She had good intentions.
"Okay."
I understand it though.
She said, "It's August. Most of them, if they got children not in school, they can bring their family," and they did.
Okay.
But
Next target unlocked. Go and work for Google.
Oh, there's a lot of benefits. Google was they were amazing. It's such a difference. Well, even little Skybox, because they modeled themselves after Google was the same way, but was such a difference from their culture and the culture on the East Coast of the United States, even today. Their culture was everything was about work hard, but have plenty of perks, food, drink. We had alcohol, no alcohol policy. We had a bar in the office. Every building had you couldn't be more than, I think it was 60 feet from food. They had a number, like it was 60 feet from food. So there were 19 restaurants on the Google campus, and you could go to any one. If you wanted sushi, you went to one. If you wanted one, they had a little bit of everything. But and the pizza, you went to. It was what you want. Every Asian denomination had their restaurant. Also, they had a mix of Asian food served in the one or two bigger restaurants. If you wanted to have a team lunch where you went over and did the cooking, they had a cooking lab, and you could get a team of maybe, I think it was about a dozen people, and they would have professionals work with you, and you could cook a special meal as a team building. You wanted to have a bowling alley, you wanted to play tennis, you wanted to play bocce, you wanted to play golf. They had everything there.
It is a full
You name it.
society. It's not a company, it's a
Oh, yeah.
society, literally. You
Yeah.
can live there. I assume they had accommodation too.
There were people that did live there. They didn't condone it, but there were
Okay.
people, some of the young people that, hey, it's cheaper than an apartment. They slept there. We had in our building, we had a complete workout. We had a massage room where you made an appointment, a masseuse came in, you had showers, you had towel service. I mean, you had everything.
Doesn't get better than that.
And we had a complete 3 meals delivered a day, breakfast, lunch, and supper. And there was always snacks there. And you had refrigerator, you could put food in, whatever you wanted. You had a full bar, you had a keg with, IPA and a light beer, a lager. You had a wine. We had wine delivered. But not only that, on the keg, we had the only difference between Skybox and Google. And when we were at Skybox, we had one tap on the keg. When we at Google, they gave us a bigger kegerator with 2 taps. We had a full espresso, one of these professional espresso machines there, and you could make your own little hockey pucks and, make espresso and beer, the kegs, the wine. We had wine delivered once a month. We replenished our wine, and we had hard liquor. And our thing was never abused. The only rule was after 4 o'clock, if you called the meeting, you had to have a pitcher of beer on the table and glasses, and you go all wine. But other than that, nobody ever abused it. We never had a problem with somebody leaving there drunk, and anybody had the ability to call Uber, and it would put it on the company bill if they felt they needed a Uber ride, even socially, even had nothing to do with where they were at somebody's house or at an event. We would, rather than get them to get behind the wheel, they could call Uber.
That is
And
the
it was
culture that
totally-
needs to be instilled, I think, in companies. So give the freedom, but respect the freedom you're given, because it's going to be a detriment to everybody else if you don't.
We never, I can say we never had that abused. I don't remember an Uber bill at all showing up from somebody. Now, they might have been embarrassed, I don't know, but I don't remember anybody putting an Uber bill on. Never had a problem with I never saw anybody at work drunk, or even at parties. We went to a couple of weddings. Everybody was, wedding happy, but even then, when somebody got married or something, they arranged that everybody had a ride home who needed it.
That's the culture that I think modern companies need. It still exists. I think not so much in the European companies. Maybe it is a culture that exists more over in the other side of the Atlantic. European
I did a
companies
little work.
tend to. We do have a very inclusive culture and a culture of acceptance and events and bonding within teams. It's very important, but not to that extent, I'd say.
Well, these were, remember, these groups that I work with at Skybox, and then even a lot of them this was their first job out of college, because Google had a habit of, going after the best and brightest, and hiring, offering them a lot to join them, nurturing them while they were in school, giving them internships. Skybox did the same thing. I mean, the engineering team there, there was 2 guys who had a little bit of experience. All the rest were fresh outs out of Stanford, out of Berkeley, out of Caltech, really good, MIT. And so this was, I mean, I will admit that as the first year I was there was about the 3rd year they were together. The office was still an extension of the frat house, but a fraternity house. It was, I mean, at 10 o'clock in the morning, there'd be one of these drones go up in the air, the little indoor drones, and 1 or 2 of them go up, and there'd be a whole bunch of other guys with Nerf guns shooting down the drones. That would be their break. And then they would play these circle puzzle games and stuff, and the loser had to make coffee for everybody. They was a frat house, environment. And it was a bullpen. There was no offices. That was a style. Even the CEO, who he and I sat back to back, there was no. He didn't have an office. If he needed a conference room, have a conference. He had to reduce a conference, and you had to schedule it. Everything was scheduled on an iPad.
Thank you, Joe, again for the insights you're giving me. Thank you for laying out very honestly, your journey. Okay. It has changed how I think. We've spoken 3 times. I can see it has changed the way I'm approaching and I'm thinking, especially on the projects at work. So thank you.
Thank you for watching this educational interview with Mr. Rothenberg. I hope you enjoyed it. Most of all, I hope you learned from it, and I will see you in the next one.